Greetings, history lovers, the historically minded, Dr. Philip W. Travis. And in this video, I want to take a moment to talk about the international order, particularly the international order from 1900 to present. This has become increasingly in the 21st century, has really become a talking point, the international order. And by that we mean what establishes the foundation for effectively right and wrong action within the international community. What establishes the basis for law and order in the world amongst nations large and small. So I want to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to break this into three chunks. So forgive me if there's some areas where maybe there should be more nuance, because I'm going to try to do this in a kind of brief video. I want to give us a big picture here to understand how the international order has changed from 1900 to the 21st century and what the potential ramifications are for those changes. The first period, when you think about a global sort of international order that I want to think about here and talk about, is the age of great power imperialism. The map you see here is showing you the major powers and the territories and colonies that they control. Great Britain up here, you see in the light pink or red, light red or pink, they control a great deal of the world as a colonial power. France in the blue. And of course, in some respects, this is a deceptive map, because this area in here, Central America and the Caribbean, is very much under the sway, the imperial sway and influence of the United States, even if they're not colonized. But this refers to the period that was particularly dominant during the 1800s, in the 1900s, up to the First World War. I'm including this up to the end of the Second World War, though the interwar periods between World War I and World War II is a unique period of time, shall we say. Though I'm not sure the world order changed. There were some efforts to change that world order, perhaps to some extent, during that period, with ideas like the 14 Points, the League of Nations. But by and large, I think it was still a world driven by this idea of great power imperialism. And so, during this period of time, you're looking at a world that is really divided amongst great powers, empires, colonial powers, and empires in general. You don't have to have colonies to be an imperial power. The foundation of this world order would be called the balance of power. Balance of power was basically a way that great powers sort of organized and ordered the world. None of the great powers have any concern whatsoever about human rights or the sovereign rights of small territories. They reserve the right to colonize areas of the developing world, to take their resources, to pacify them, meaning that's an imperial term for when people resist. Effectively, colonial powers would enact wars of annihilation. They would declare the resistors bandits, and they would enact wars of pacification, annihilation on those people resisting colonial control. So this world order is in no way, shape, or form giving much consideration in the developing world to smaller countries, to their sovereignty or human rights at all. What makes this world order function is great powers effectively dictate the rules. They reserve the right to take colonies, to take territories, to steal resources. And the way they maintain or avoid major conflicts, the way they maintain a balance amongst each other, is this thing called the balance of power. And what that means is effectively the great powers establish this principle that no one power should be allowed to become the dominant power. And effectively, when one power was becoming more powerful than they should be, other great powers might come and there could be a conflict. The Crimean War was an example of this. The British and the French argued that the Russians were offsetting the balance of power by their incursions into contested areas with the Ottoman Empire, and a war broke out. This is basically a period of time where great powers, they establish colonies, they carve out spheres of influence in the world, and as long as no one power hugely offsets the balance of power, there's not a war. The problem, of course, with this is great powers establish red lines, and a lot of times those red lines are not really clearly apparent where they're at. And the danger, of course, is when that red line is crossed. And that's kind of what happened with the First World War. You had secret treaties in place between major powers. And if you look at the map of Europe, you will see up here, Europe looks very different. A huge German empire, a huge Austro-Hungarian empire. Here's France, Italy, very, very few of the small countries that you might recognize today. But the First World War, right, you had the assassination of Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist that was part of Serbia, and they were aligned with Russia, with the Russian Empire. The German Empire basically encouraged a war over this as a way to seek greater power in Europe, in the world broadly. And that resulted in a war, effectively. So that was a case really where, Germany was seen as really offsetting, throwing off the balance of power, shall we say. So that's where there was a red line there, and it led to these secret treaties and war declarations and a huge war. So that's really the world order driven by competition and a balance of power between great world powers, imperial powers. Come to the post-World War II period, and this is the world order that most people, when they think about a world order, this is what most folks probably think about. And I'm calling this Roosevelt's world order. After World War II, and during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt had created an architecture for a new world order, for a different type of world that wouldn't be driven by great powers just colonizing parts of the world and establishing order based on a balance of power. During the war, Roosevelt justified American efforts in the Second World War based on something called the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter, very much in the spirit of some of Woodrow Wilson's ideas of how peace might be achieved after the First World War, Roosevelt argued that you had to have an international organization that would oversee the rights of countries throughout the world, that imperialism and colonialism, but particularly colonialism, should be a thing of the past, and that effectively there should be global arms reductions and a promotion of social security across the world, and that none of the powers fighting in World War II, this is also part of the Atlantic Charter, would use the war to gain more territory. In addition, Roosevelt, at the same time, at home in the United States in 1944, presented his Economic Bill of Rights, or his Second Bill of Rights, in which he presented sort of a domestic version of the Atlantic Charter in some respects, in which he effectively asserted that industrial capitalism had created such changes in the world that the United States, if the American dream and the principle of justice in the United States for all people was to survive, that the United States needed to ensure that people had basically their necessities met, that small businesses could be competitive, that people had health care, that everybody could get a good education, that everybody had a home, that everybody had a living wage job. This type of thing was the spirit of what was in the Economic Bill of Rights. And Roosevelt suggested that they should be included as an addendum to the existing Bill of Rights. So these were bold things that he thought the New World needed so that people domestically could have peace and security at home, much like the Atlantic Charter. He hoped it would create a world that was sort of centered around the idea of peace and security. And so, in the context of the post-World War II period, you see here a map of the Cold War, the bipolar world, for lack of a better term, free versus authoritarian. We know that it's more complicated than that, but for our purposes here, right? The American sphere in the blue, the Soviet sphere in the red, and there's non-aligned states in the grayish color here as well. Non-aligned or closely aligned with one or the other. So the Roosevelt world order was centered, what moored it, the thing that it was all about was that human rights and national sovereignty would be the foundation, the thing that would determine rightness in the world, that we would base the world system around people's rights to national sovereignty, around human rights. And effectively, it would be violations of those things that would determine when international law, when the international world order, the principles of it were being violated. Of course, the fundamental flaw in this, of course, is it's still an order that is led by a great power, the United States. It's an American-led order. It's an American-led idea. And within the United Nations, which was designed to be a collective of nations that would sort of oversee this world order, the great powers that were part of the United Nations, including the Soviet Union, but the United States, they all have veto power, of course, when it comes to major issues of global security. And so a flaw in this was that big powers were not prevented from breaking the rules. And of course, they did break the rules, albeit when the United States, of course, violated these principles. There's a long list, of course. Mossadegh in Iran was overthrown and the Shah was implanted. Arbenz in Guatemala, Pinochet in Chile was inserted as a dictator after the overthrow of Salvador Allende. The list goes on and on and on. U.S. involvement in Nicaragua. However, with that said, these efforts were always, the United States kind of always tried to keep these things relatively covert, right? Meaning that even though it was violating the principles of this international order, it still held that principle as the standard. Even though it got to break them, even though it was flawed, it's American-led, they're breaking the rules, it was still the thing that they wanted to reach for. It was still the thing they wanted to aspire for. They still wanted to say that there was a reasonable doubt to say that they uplifted this new order, where a liberal order, where sort of the foundations of sovereign rights and human rights, of people's rights in the world, would be the mooring point of justice and order in the world. When we get to the 21st century, we see this begin to unravel. The 21st century is witnessing a return to great power imperialism. And I would say this starts with the global war on terrorism following the September 11th attacks. Particularly examples of this are things like the preventative war against Iraq. Iraq, a country that was not involved in September 11th, and the Bush administration never said they were. They were not involved in September 11th. They were not a deeply embedded terrorist state. However, they were seen as a potential threat, and so the United States took its opportunity to unseat that regime in the hopes that it would establish a more American-centric power in the region. This sort of began this process of unraveling the Roosevelt's international order, the world order post-1945, because what the United States was doing, which was something it had never done before in the Cold War, was to overtly go against the core principle of that international order, which was a right to national sovereignty of other countries. Going against that overtly, again, they went against it covertly. They did not go against it during the Cold War overtly. Now, post-Cold War, 1991, the United States, this is sometimes called by grand strategists in international relations schools of thought, the post-Cold War period, after 1991, there's a brief moment of time that is sometimes referred to as the unipolar moment. This is a moment when the United States really emerged as the single great power. It became a world hegemonic power. And the Bush doctrine that led to conflicts like the Iraq conflict was really based on the idea that the United States believed that it would be like the sort of sole emanator of the world order. It would be a global hegemonic power, and any other greater powers would even themselves be subordinate to the United States. Of course, in the 21st century, other powers emerge as rivals, particularly China, and Russia, begins to seek to at least reestablish its position as a legitimate world power. And in this context, the idea of human rights, of international law, of national sovereignty really is marginalized, despite what some leaders may say in certain contexts, is really marginalized in the interest of the self-interest of great powers. And so we're witnessing a return to this, where the standard of national sovereignty, the standard of international law, of human rights, is really no longer sort of the gold standard. It's no longer the mooring of the international world. Instead, we're looking more at a world where great powers are sort of seeking to, if you will, chisel out their spheres of influence, establish red lines in areas, and compete and vie for influence with other great powers. Now, One of the problems with this, of course, or at least one of the dangers of this is coming in the context of the United States of the end of the unipolar moment. It's coming in the context of the United States as like global hegemonic power becoming reduced and waning and falling into more of a world where you have multiple great powers, as opposed to the United States being like the driver of international power in the world. And so that's a danger, because the United States may seek to hold on to its hegemony. And if it holds on to its hegemony, it might challenge other great powers when it comes to their assertions of spheres of influence. Of course, you have confrontations over Ukraine. Taiwan is right down here. You see it's in red, which is associated that it's in the American sphere of orbit. But of course, great power China very much believes that Taiwan is its sphere of orbit. So in a lot of respects, you've returned to more of a pre-World War I period, where you have great powers. They're chiseling out spheres of influence. They're vying and competing for power. And the question here is, especially in the context of the United States' attempt to maintain its hegemony, where is the red line? Where is that red line crossed? Because if that red line's crossed, you could find yourself in a major world conflict. Not to say that any of the conflicts of the 21st century have not been major, because there have been quite a few very, very significant and destructive conflicts, but a major conflict involving these world powers. And so that's kind of one of the dangers you see there. So, the Russian war in Ukraine, 2022, it violated the norms set by Roosevelt's old post-World War II world order. It violates the principle of national sovereignty. The U.S. attack on Iraq in 2003 violated Roosevelt's principle of national sovereignty. And there are numerous other cases. And effectively, the world powers have to a large degree asserted that order, those ideas of the preeminence of national sovereignty, of human rights, and of international law as they were understood in the post-World War II order for more than half a century, really asserted that those are no longer sort of the mooring of the international order. And instead, the mooring of the international order seems to be something that looks more like a pre-World War I sort of order. Great powers competing and seeking to maintain a balance of power. And as long as that balance of power is recognized, and as long as neither country steps too far into offsetting that balance of power, a war might be avoided. But where is that red line? And so I just wanted to talk about this because it's something that's been talked about a lot in the 21st century, the idea of the international order and sort of the changing international order. And so I do think that the Rooseveltian international order, centering on human rights and national sovereignty post-World War II, I do think as much as the United States and other powers fell short of that ideal, that was the ideal. But I do think that has increasingly ceased to be the standard for the international order, largely by the choices of the world powers today. And so we enter into this new age of world order, and it's a potentially dangerous one. They're always dangerous, but in this case, like, the world is always dangerous when you have major powers with nuclear weapons and huge armies, right? But when you have great powers fighting and vying to maintain or advance their spheres of influence in highly contested and important parts of the world, where is that line? And if that line's crossed, there could be a real risk to a major conflict. So I wanted us to give some background and think about that. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next video. Please subscribe to my channel if you like this video. I'm Dr. Philip W. Travis. This is History Changes.